Hello and welcome to Rapid Flow. My name is Eric, I'm the founder, and today we're going to be diving into subtractive synthesis. I'm going to show you exactly how you create sounds using the basics, the fundamentals of subtractive synthesis, which is what most analog synths are based upon, but a lot of the plugins also these days work exactly that way. Now, to get us started, so you have a first idea of what this means, basically it means that you start out with a very big sound, which is the sound coming off of your oscillator. And then you use things like filters and envelopes to control that sound and make it more like you want to use it in your track. So not every sound has to be a huge brass tone that just spreads out forever. Maybe you want a punchy bass line, maybe you want a pluck, maybe you want a pad, and all those are the things that you subtract from the raw oscillator shape. So for this video today, I'm going to be using the Prophet 10, which is, I think, a very nice synth to learn on because it gives you a clear overview. On this session, we're not going to go into all the polymod and LFO stuff. We're just going to start with the basics here, but I'm going to be doing more of these. So if you want to dive deeper into synthesis and also look at things like LFOs and polymods and all those kinds of things, please subscribe to the channel and give us a like if this video was helpful to you. Rapid Flow is not only a YouTube channel, but we also have a store where we offer masterclasses, we offer templates for fast production workflows, samples, and now also an instrument, a VST called Zensphere that contains samples recorded amongst others from this Prophet 10, but also from 17 other analog synths we have in the studio, all pre-processed and ready to go in your mix. So it all starts with the oscillators. You have oscillator A with 2 waveforms, oscillator B with 3 waveforms. From there it goes to the mixer where you can add the amount of these oscillators, and from there you can also add noise. Then it goes to the filter, which is what shapes how much of the high frequencies in the case of the Prophet 10 are coming through. And then finally it goes to the amplifier or the amp envelope. And what this does is it automates the loudness of the sound. So for example, an organ, when you press a note, it's just full blast on and then off again. With synthesizers, we can actually choose how that sound's going to come in and come out. So let's start first maybe with a triangle oscillator, and let me give you an idea how it sounds. So very basic. And right now, because the way that my envelope is set up, I am basically going to do it now so that it switches on and off. You see? Now let me go and show you what a square sounds like. It has kind of a wider sound. Let's bring in oscillator B and do the same. And the cool thing is, with most synthesizers, you're able to tune and fine-tune the way these wave shapes will work against each other. So now I have both on, both are on in the mixer. And now let me bring in... So you hear this like a detuning because they're not absolutely perfect. This is the beauty very often of analog synths, but you can recreate this in plugins. Now let me show you what happens when I move the fine-tune. So what we're doing now in essence is we're choosing what our basic original sound is going to be that we're then going to shape with the rest of the building blocks, the signal processing parts of this synthesizer. Now I'm going to do the same for you with the square so you can have a listen to what that sounds like. And the cool thing about square waves is that they have the possibility to use pulse width modulation. So let me show you that. That's the sound that kind of goes like swirls through your head. If you've heard that in a club or on a big pad or something, that's where that's coming from. The Prophet 5 and 10 then still have a sine wave, which is more like just for super deep stuff that you want to put under to fill out a sound. And that's it. That's what we start with, the beginning, the source of the sound that you're going to be able to use for your synth. So you should be looking, if you're using a plugin or another synth, like almost 90% of synths basically work this way. Look for OSC, OSC, that's oscillator A or B, or OA, something along those lines, that's the oscillator. And you'll see very often these kinds of drawings which represent what kind of a waveform you're sending in. Now for most bass stuff, and this is maybe already like a first small recommendation I would give you, I would recommend you to start with just one oscillator and one waveform. The Prophet 5 and 10, actually from here on in, I'm just going to say Prophet 10, keep it simple, but they're kind of the same. This just has more voices. You can also use 2 waveforms at the same time, but listen to what that sounds like. Not just one. you'll get cleaner, punchier bass with less phasing and internal kind of weirdness if you just use one oscillator. We now have this, and now I would like to show you what happens, of course, when we start to bring the filter in. The filter has a couple of options. You have your cutoff, which is how much of the high frequencies you're going to remove. Where does that filter start? You have resonance, which gives it a peak so that you can make stuff at the cutoff point louder. It has envelope amount, which is an automated moving of your filter by using an ADSR envelope, which stands for attack, decay, sustain, release. And this is actually very simple to know what happens. The attack is how quickly the movement starts. The decay is how quickly it slows down to the part where your sustain takes over. And then the release is after you let go of the key, how long that in this case, filter envelope will continue to be active. There's a second envelope on most synths, which is the amplifier envelope. And you'll often see ADSR or AADSR and FADSR. Those are the general abbreviations for these things on the front of your VST or synth panel. That's where you can get a lot of your groove is from the envelope. If things are just triggering on and off all the time, it gets very robotic. But I'll show you today also a trick for how you can use your envelope to make stuff feel really funky. Let's go back now, and we're going to keep the way that the synth is set up very straight. It's just on off, and I'm going to start to bring in the filter so you can listen to what the filter is doing. So you hear that little click that we have right now. This is a very common thing with synthesizers, that if your attack and release are too fast, then you hear that click because the sound is just basically being cut off immediately. So usually I start with the attack. In this case, it's not there. It's in the release primarily of the amplifier. So now we have still a fast sound, but we don't have the click every time we let go of the key. So let me show you back. Let's go back to the filter cutoff and let me show you. Now we could add resonance, which at a certain point can also start to get very loud. But it's a way, for example, like a TB303, when it's doing the squeechy, acidic acid sound, that's resonance very often. But it can be super helpful also for beefing up a bass. Let me show you. You look for the frequency. Also cool for making kick drums and stuff on synthesizer. So resonance is very useful. I personally don't use it a ton. I like the sounds more clean and wide, but very useful. So now we will start to look at the amplifier envelope so you get a feeling for what you can do with that. I generally like to have the sound in such a way that it extends a bit when I let go of the key. So now we have a sound that doesn't cut off immediately when I let go of the key because I've raised the release. And now let me bring in the filter cutoff again. And what you could do now is do a similar kind of automation on the level or the movement of the filter by using the envelope amount. Let me show you. You hear how the filter is opening up and then closing down again? So in essence, what it's doing is this. But I'm choosing the amount with the envelope amount, how wide it's going to open or how high in frequency it's going to open. And then with the ADSR, I can actually choose again the curve of how that's going to happen. So let me show you. Keep it very compact, keep the sustain level long, keep the release long of the filter. And the combination of these two ADSRs is where a lot of the magic is in plucks, in percussion, in bass sounds. Getting that right, and I'm going to show you that in this video also, is where you can really get a lot of the vibe and groove, especially against your kick and toms and other percussion stuff. Cool, so this has all just been with one oscillator. Now what we could, for example, do is bring in a second and detune it for a slightly bigger, wider sound. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. So already now we're starting to get a sound that's swinging a bit, and this could actually be a good basis, for example, for a pad. So what I'd like to do is make the release a bit longer. And I don't want so much envelope amount. I want this to stay quite constant. And this now, without exaggerating on the release time so that it doesn't just keep playing forever, would be what potentially could be a super nice pad. So what I'm going to do to make this more usable as a pad is use this function here called keyboard, which has half and full, which means it's going to track, if I play higher up the keyboard, it's going to automatically also open the filter a little bit. So let's have a listen. Okay, that's good. So let's listen to what this would sound like now with a high sustain and a long release. So now you have a sound which would be spacious and which you could use for a pad because of how we've set this. But if we would want to turn this sound into a bass type sound, it's very simple. I'm just going to shorten the end of the sound, so the sustain and release. And there you go. And now I've been saying that I'm going to show you what it sounds like when you mess with the ADSR of your synth sound while it's playing against the kick. So let me switch on Ableton. Let me run the kick and let me send this some MIDI notes so you get an idea of what that sounds like. So for my taste personally now, this bass is a bit too short and a bit too compact. It doesn't feel like it's really in a nice place with the music. And this is something that we can do, or with the kick drum, this is something we can do very effectively with the envelope. So let me show you. The first thing I would do is make it a little bit longer. Like already there, it feels much better. So what this is doing now is giving it the possibility to groove a bit against the kick and to not just cut off every time so hard. And now we could experiment a little bit with the decay and sustain perhaps. Make it a little bit more compact. So I've just lowered the sustain of the amplifier envelope. Like there you could get it really compact, but I wanted to have some energy. That's already feeling much better. And now the next step, what we could do is see where we can take this with the envelope. Like that's too much. Could reduce it a bit. Yeah, there's a whole universe to explore in the combination of this ADSR envelopes. So this right now is two oscillators playing. Let's remove one. And maybe let's try this an octave up. Let's take it back an octave. So now we're using a bit of resonance. Let's remove it. And now let's hear the same sound with the square oscillator. So experiment with your ADSR envelopes and see where things start to groove and feel right, because that's like really where half the magic is in making a bass line. If this bass line would happen to be eighth notes or quarter notes playing kind of off the kick, then the envelope settings would probably be very different. And listen to the difference if I make the release very short again. It's like the notes are still playing the same, but it doesn't feel right anymore, right? Now, the only risk that you can have if you have a release that's kind of playing this long is that it starts to fight against your kick, which is why very often in electronic music, we put a sidechain on the bass that is triggered by the kick drum. So every time the kick plays, the bass gets ducked for a little bit so that this doesn't become an issue if it's playing longer notes. I often use a frequency-dependent sidechain, which just cuts the low end of the bass, but leaves the rest so that the vibe is still there, which is also a super nice way to do it. That is, in essence, the basics of using a subtractive synth and using its parameters. Now, of course, you can do a ton more here. So let me give you a quick overview of some of the other functions that are part of a subtractive synth for this first tutorial to get us started. First, let's actually start by putting this into unison mode, this synth. All that means is it's going to play all its oscillators all at the same time, so you can get like a very beefy, very fat sound. Let's have a listen. I'm going to switch to unison and maybe going to add a few more oscillators here. And where this could get interesting is actually if you start to detune or maybe use the vintage mode. What the vintage mode does on a Prophet 10, it brings in some unexactness, some slop in the oscillators and the envelopes. Let me open the filter, you'll hear it better. Let me do this with a chord so it'll be easier for you to hear this. This is vintage off. It's wide, but it's very exact. And now let me bring vintage all the way up. Can be super cool, especially if you send it through a massive reverb, but in essence what this is doing, it's just making the sound more chaotic. It's bringing in random elements in the oscillator tuning as well as the way that the envelopes are triggering. So the other thing we can do is turn on oscillator sync, which in essence what it's doing is it's keeping the tuning the same, but we're compressing the wave of the synth against the two oscillators. Let me show you. So now we're back to both playing in a C. Let me drop one an octave. That's how they made the sound of Neo in the Matrix swallowing the molten mirror, by the way. Combined with some voice. This is the sync function, which in essence is linking together the basic tuning of the oscillators. So it's a good way to keep them very tight in tune if you're going for a dual oscillator bass patch, for example, but it allows you to add like some edge to it by turning the frequency of the oscillators. A very important tip, I think, when creating bass lines, for example, is that if it feels like your bass line is fighting with your kick a lot, very often the better way to go rather than starting to EQ it and compress it and all these things is to shift the octave where that bass line is playing. So if this would be playing against the kick drum, and I'm like, this feels like it's fighting too much with the bass, rather than starting to EQ it now for 10 minutes, what I would rather do is actually shift it up an octave. So let me show you. And actually, maybe we want to unsync them and bring one in lower. So a lot can be done with the tuning of the oscillators against each other. And in this case, what I think I would go for is one tuned quite high and then one as a sub below it. Let me show you. So these are now tuned an octave apart. I actually even liked oscillator A in the higher octave range. Let's do that. And in this case, I would probably just take it down a little bit in the mixer. So it's just giving it like a little bit of the higher note so that it cuts through the mix better. Just a little bit. Without it, just a touch. And then the final thing that I haven't shown you is glide rate. So if we set the synth to unison mode again, we can glide from the notes that I'm playing up and down. So let me bring in the oscillators again. So what this is doing is it's not going from one pitch to the other, but it's playing or smoothly going from one place to the other. This can be very cool to make a sound that starts high and goes super deep, kind of like for a break or something. So like you can do cool stuff like that using unison mode and then glide. If it's not in unison mode, it's not gonna do it. So that's a peculiarity that if you want to use glide, in many cases, you need to be in unison or mono legato mode. These are obviously all the functions for saving patches on the synthesizer. But if you manage to get your head around the oscillator A, B, the mixer, the filter and its envelope, and the general envelope that controls the loudness, you already have the possibility to make a lot of the basic sounds from pluck, stabs, leads, basses, etc. all there. If you want to do a stab, it's kind of like making a bass, so like a short sustain. Something like this maybe. And without the envelope, this sound would be you would never be able to get to a pluck. Let me switch envelopes fully open. And what you're hearing now is basically the full output of the oscillator without, so we're doing like synthesis without the subtractive part, but actually through the filter and its envelope and the general amplifier envelope, you're able to then mold that sound. And that is the essence of subtractive synthesis. On the next episode of this, we're going to start looking more at things that are here in the polymod section, which is how you can modulate everything from the frequency of the oscillators to the pulse width amount, the filter, generally the LFO, and how that works. The LFO is a low frequency oscillator. It's in essence the same as this with different wave shapes, but it functions at a much lower speed so that you can modulate things in your synth with it. And then the Prophet 10 has this wheel mod where you can again send a certain amount of modulation to other parts of the synth. We're going to look at that in another episode of this. All right. So I hope that this has been helpful for you to get a better understanding of what subtractive synthesis is like. The principles I've shown you here today apply to almost any synthesizer that is based on subtractive synthesis, both as hardware and plugins. Let me leave you with tweaking this sound back to a baseline so that you see again just how easy and fast it is once you wrap your head around these concepts. And I hope that you have a better understanding now of this and that you can start to create your sounds from scratch rather than looking for presets. Very often you'll get to the result you're looking for faster if you just make it than looking through a preset list, because once you know what the parameters do, it's not actually that difficult. All right, I hope this was helpful. Let me start the sequencer here again and make a bass out of this, and I'll see you on the next video. Take it easy. Bye-bye.